There comes a moment in life when you realize that not every battle is meant to be fought with words. Not every wound is healed by another explanation. Not every distance is closed by another message. And not every heart is reached by running harder towards someone who keeps stepping away. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is become silent. Because silence is not weakness. Silence is power disciplined by wisdom. When someone has grown comfortable in emotional distance, they may begin to feel a sense of detachment or disconnection from the other person. They often begin to live under an illusion, the illusion that they control the rhythm of the connection. They believe they can pull away whenever they want, return whenever they please, and still find you waiting in the same place, with the same open hands and the same aching heart. That illusion survives on one thing: your constant availability. The moment you stop feeding that illusion, everything changes. Your silence becomes a mirror. It forces them to face what your presence once protected them from. The reality of your absence. You see, people often do not understand the value of something when it is always within reach. But when your energy withdraws, when your voice no longer rushes in to fill the space, when your attention is no longer offered freely, the silence begins to speak, and what it says is this: I know my worth. That is a divine principle. Self-respect is sacred. Love was never meant to require you to abandon yourself. You were not created to beg for consistency. You were not designed to convince someone to see your value. And you were certainly not meant to shrink your dignity in exchange for temporary attention. The truth is, your silence does not merely affect them. It transforms you. Because in the quiet, you stop listening to fear and start listening to truth. Truth says, if someone wants access to your heart, they must approach it with intention. Truth says, love that is real does not need to be chased into existence. Truth says, what is meant for you will meet you in mutual effort, not in emotional confusion. There is divine wisdom in stepping back, because sometimes God removes your voice from the situation so your spirit can finally hear what your pain was drowning out. Their distance was teaching you something. Their inconsistency was revealing something. Their avoidance was not a reflection of your worth, but a revelation of their limitations. And once you understand that, you stop personalizing their behavior. You stop asking, why am I not enough? And you begin asking the more powerful question, why am I settling for less than I deserve? That question changes everything. Because your silence is no longer about making them miss you. It becomes about remembering yourself. It becomes about reclaiming peace. It becomes about refusing to participate in a dynamic that cost you your soul. And here is the deeper truth. Silence breaks the avoidance illusion of control, because it reminds them that your love was a gift, not a guarantee. The moment they realize you are no longer orbiting around their indecision, the ground beneath their certainty begins to shake. Now they must confront what they thought they could postpone forever. Loss, consequences, reality. But whether they return or not is no longer the point. Read that again in your heart. Whether they return or not is no longer the point. Because the real victory is that you return to yourself. You chose dignity over desperation, peace over panic, faith over fear. And that is where transformation begins. Sometimes silence is the language of endings. Sometimes it is the language of awakening. But always, when rooted in self-respect and divine purpose, it is the language of power. So do not fear the quiet. Let it refine you. Let it teach you. Let it remind you that what is truly yours will never require you to lose yourself to keep it. Your silence is not emptiness. It is the sound of your soul rising. There is a quiet moment that arrives when you finally stop reaching, stop explaining, stop trying to prove your value to someone who benefits from your effort more than they honor your presence. And in that moment, something shifts. Not outside of you at first, but within you. Because every time you chase, every time you overextend, every time you give more than what is being met, you are not just offering love, you are slowly giving away your power. Emotional power is not loud. It doesn't demand attention or beg for validation. It exists in your ability to choose where your energy goes, who receives it, and under what conditions it is shared. But when you find yourself constantly initiating, constantly fixing, constantly trying to hold things together, you unknowingly place your emotional state in someone else's hands. Your peace becomes dependent on their response. Your happiness starts to hinge on their consistency. And without realizing it, you begin to orbit around their behavior. Silence disrupts that pattern. Because silence is not just the absence of words, it is the return of energy. It is you deciding that your time, your attention, your emotional investment are not things to be handed out in desperation, but things to be given with intention. When you become silent, you stop leaking energy into a space that is not nourishing you. You stop pouring into a connection that only thrives when you are the one sustaining it. And this is where your power begins to come back. Not all at once, not in some dramatic cinematic way, but gradually, quietly, almost like a muscle that hasn't been used in a long time, beginning to wake up again. You start to feel the difference between giving from fullness and giving from fear. You begin to notice how much of your effort was driven by the anxiety of losing someone, rather than the joy of being with them. Silence creates space for that awareness. Because when you are no longer distracted by constant communication, you are finally able to see the dynamic for what it is. You see how much you were doing. You see how little was being reciprocated. And more importantly, you start to ask yourself why you were willing to accept that imbalance in the first place. That question is powerful because it shifts the focus away from them and brings it back to you. And when your focus returns to you, so does your control. You begin to make different choices. You stop reacting instantly. You stop jumping to fill every gap. You allow things to unfold without your interference. And in doing so, you send a message not just to them, but to yourself that your energy is valuable, that it is not to be overused, overextended, or given in hopes of being chosen. This is what reclaiming emotional power looks like. It's not about punishing the other person. It's not about playing games or trying to manipulate outcomes. It's about realigning with your own worth. It's about understanding that your presence in someone's life is meaningful. And if they cannot meet you with the same level of intention, then your energy deserves a different direction. Because the truth is, the more you give without boundaries, the less your energy is respected not just by others, but by you. And silence restores that boundary. It allows you to step back and say, without words, I will not abandon myself to keep this connection alive. It allows you to choose peace over urgency, clarity over confusion, and self-respect over emotional chaos. And in that space, something remarkable happens. You no longer feel the need to control the outcome, because you have finally learned to control the one thing that was always yours to begin with, your energy. There is a subtle dynamic that often goes unnoticed in emotionally distant connections, and it is this. People grow comfortable not because everything is secure, but because everything feels predictable. When someone believes you will always be there, always responding, always reaching out, always keeping the connection alive, they begin to build a quiet sense of certainty around you. Not necessarily respect, not necessarily deep appreciation, but certainty. And certainty in the wrong dynamic can become a false form of control. This is how the illusion begins. It's not that they consciously decide to take control, it's that your consistency becomes something they rely on without question. They pull away, and you lean in. They go quiet, and you fill the silence. They become distant, and you try harder to close the gap. Over time, this creates a rhythm where they set the pace, and you adjust yourself to match it. And in that rhythm, they start to feel like they hold the power not because they are stronger, but because they are less invested in maintaining the connection. That imbalance creates a dangerous kind of comfort, because when someone feels they can step back without consequence, they stop fearing loss. And when there is no fear of loss, there is no urgency to show up differently. They assume that no matter how inconsistent they are, you will remain constant. That no matter how distant they become, you will find your way back to them. And this assumption becomes the foundation of their illusion. But it is just that, an illusion, because it is not built on true connection. It is built on your willingness to carry the emotional weight of the relationship. The moment you remove that weight, everything begins to shift. When your messages stop coming, when your effort is no longer filling the space, when your presence is no longer guaranteed in the same way, the certainty they once relied on starts to crack. And for the first time, they are faced with something unfamiliar: uncertainty. Uncertainty forces awareness. It makes them question what changed. It disrupts the pattern they had grown used to. And most importantly, it confronts them with the possibility that you are no longer operating within the role they assigned you, the one who always stays, always gives, always waits. This is where absence becomes powerful, not because it is meant to punish, but because it reveals truth. It exposes the fact that what they thought was stable was actually dependent on your effort. It shows that their sense of control was never real, it was simply unchallenged. And when something goes unchallenged for long enough, it begins to feel permanent. Your absence reminds them that it isn't. It reminds them that your presence was a choice, not an obligation. That your consistency was an act of care, not something they were entitled to. And when that realization sets in, the emotional dynamic begins to rebalance. Because now, they are no longer certain. And in the absence of certainty, people are forced to feel. They feel the distance they once created. They feel the silence they once ignored. They feel the gap that your energy used to fill so effortlessly. And in that space, they come face to face with something they may have avoided for a long time, the value of what they had. But whether they act on that realization or not is secondary. What matters is that the illusion is broken. Because once that illusion is gone, the dynamic can never return to what it was. The unspoken assumption that you will always be there, no matter what, no longer holds the same weight. And in its place, a new truth begins to emerge, one where your presence must be met with intention, not taken for granted. That is the power of absence. It doesn't beg to be noticed. It simply removes what was once given so freely. And in doing so, it reveals everything that was misunderstood. There is something deeply uncomfortable about being left alone with the consequences of your own behavior. Most people don't realize how much they rely on distraction, on conversation, on attention, on the other person reaching out to avoid having to sit with what they've created. When communication is constant, it becomes easy to bypass reflection. There's always another message, another moment of connection, another chance to smooth things over without ever truly confronting the pattern. But silence removes that escape. When you stop responding, when you no longer rush in to keep the emotional flow alive, you take away the cushion that once softened the impact of their actions. Suddenly, there is space. And in that space, there is no longer anything to hide behind. No immediate reassurance, no quick validation, no familiar rhythm to lean on, just stillness. And stillness has a way of bringing truth to the surface. Because without your presence filling the gaps, they are left with their own thoughts. They begin to replay interactions, not because you demanded accountability, but because your absence creates the conditions for awareness. They notice the distance they created. They recognize the moments they pulled away. They become aware of how often you were the one maintaining connection while they remained passive. This is what silence does. It invites reflection without force. You are no longer trying to explain how you feel. You are no longer asking them to understand. You are no longer guiding them toward empathy or clarity. Instead, you step back, and in doing so, you allow them the opportunity to arrive at those realizations on their own. And realizations that come unprompted are often the most powerful, because they are not driven by pressure or persuasion. They are driven by experience, by the feeling of your absence, by the contrast between what was and what is now missing. It is one thing to hear someone say, "You're being distant." It is another thing entirely to feel the distance, when the other person is no longer there to bridge it for you. Silence creates that contrast. It highlights the imbalance that once existed, not through accusation, but through absence. And that absence can be confronting, because it removes the ability to deflect, to minimize, or to rely on you to keep things comfortable. It places them in a position where they must either acknowledge what has been happening or continue avoiding it, at the cost of losing the connection altogether. And this is where a shift becomes possible. Not guaranteed, but possible. Because when someone is faced with the reality of what their behavior leads to, they are given a choice. They can continue as they were, accepting the distance and disconnection that follows. Or they can begin to question themselves, to look inward, to consider whether their patterns are costing them something meaningful. But that choice only exists when there is space to see clearly. Constant communication often blurs that clarity. It keeps things moving, keeps emotions circulating, keeps the connection alive just enough to avoid real confrontation with the truth. Silence, on the other hand, slows everything down. It removes the noise. It allows both people, especially the one who is less aware, to sit with what is actually happening. And that is where reflection begins. Not because you forced it, not because you demanded it, but because your silence made it unavoidable. Patterns don't sustain themselves by accident. They survive because two people, often unconsciously, keep playing their parts. One withdraws, the other pursues. One becomes distant, the other tries harder. One creates space, the other rushes in to close it. Over time, this dynamic becomes so familiar that it starts to feel normal, even when it's quietly draining both people involved. You might tell yourself, this is just how they are, while adjusting more and more of your behavior to keep the connection intact. You become quicker to respond, more patient than you actually feel, more understanding than your boundaries would naturally allow. And the more you adapt, the more the pattern deepens. Not because it's healthy, but because it's consistent. Consistency, even in dysfunction, creates a kind of comfort. The avoidant learns that distance will be met with pursuit, that silence will be answered with effort, that their withdrawal does not end. The connection, it activates it. And you, without meaning to, reinforce that expectation every time you step in to fix what they step away from. This is how cycles become entrenched. They repeat not because they are right, but because they are uninterrupted. Silence is what interrupts them. When you choose not to chase, not to immediately respond, not to fill the emotional gap, you introduce something unfamiliar into the dynamic. You break the sequence. The usual cause and effect no longer applies. Their withdrawal is no longer followed by your pursuit. Their silence is no longer met with your reassurance. And that disruption matters, because patterns rely on predictability. When predictability disappears, the pattern loses its structure. It can no longer function the way it once did. The rhythm is broken, and in that break, both people are forced to experience something different. For you, it may feel uncomfortable at first. There can be an urge to return to what's familiar, to reach out, to fix, to restore the connection to what it was. But what it was is exactly what kept you in a cycle of imbalance. Staying silent, holding your position requires strength, because you are resisting not just the other person's behavior, but your own conditioned response to it. And that is where real change begins. Because you are no longer participating in the dynamic that kept the imbalance alive. You are no longer reinforcing a system where your effort compensates for their distance. Instead, you are allowing the connection to stand on its own, without intervention, without overcompensation. And that reveals something important. A connection that only survives when one person is constantly holding it together is not stable, it is dependent. It depends on your willingness to keep giving, to keep adjusting, to keep absorbing the imbalance. When you step back, you remove that support, and the true nature of the connection becomes visible. Either it finds a new balance, or it begins to fall apart. But even that outcome is clarity, because silence doesn't just interrupt the pattern, it exposes whether there is anything beyond the pattern worth holding on to. It shows whether the other person is capable of meeting you halfway when you are no longer doing all the work. It reveals whether there is mutual effort beneath the surface, or if the entire dynamic was built on one-sided persistence. And in that revelation, you gain something powerful. Freedom from repetition. You are no longer stuck reacting in the same way, hoping for a different result. You are no longer caught in a loop where your actions are predictable and your needs are secondary. You have stepped outside the cycle, and once you are outside of it, you can finally see it clearly. And when you can see it clearly, you can choose differently. Words can be persuasive, emotional, even beautifully expressed, but they are often limited by how they are received. You can explain your feelings with clarity, repeat your needs with patience, and still find that nothing truly changes. Not because your words lack meaning, but because words alone do not always carry the weight of conviction. They can be heard, acknowledged, even temporarily validated, yet still not taken seriously if they are not supported by action. This is where self-respect becomes visible, not in what you say, but in what you allow. Because every time you express a boundary and then bend it, every time you communicate a need and then settle for less, you are essentially saying that you will not be satisfied until you get what you want. You unintentionally teach the other person how to treat you. You show them that your words are flexible, that your standards can be negotiated, that your presence remains available even when your needs are not being met. And over time, this creates a quiet contradiction. You say, I deserve consistency, but you stay in inconsistency. You say, I need effort, but you accept minimal effort. You say, this matters to me, but your actions suggest that you will remain even when it is not honored. This is not a failure of communication. It is a misalignment between your voice and your behavior. Silence resolves that misalignment. Because when you step back, when you stop engaging in the same way, when you remove your presence from a situation that does not reflect your worth, you are no longer explaining your value, you are demonstrating it. Pausa, you are no longer asking to be respected, you are embodying self-respect. And that message is far more powerful than any conversation, because it cannot be debated. There is no room for misunderstanding when your actions are clear. You are not arguing your case, you are living your standard. You are showing in real time that access to you is not unconditional, that your time, your energy, your emotional investment are not things to be taken lightly or treated casually. This is what it means for self-respect to speak. It does not raise its voice. It does not chase acknowledgement. It simply stands firm in truth and allows others to respond to it as they will. And that firmness changes the dynamic. Because when someone realizes that you are no longer willing to stay in a situation that diminishes you, they are faced with a new reality. The version of you that tolerated imbalance, that overextended, that made excuses is no longer present. In its place is someone who honors themselves enough to walk away from what does not align. That shift commands a different level of attention. Not because you demanded it, but because you earned it through consistency with yourself. And whether the other person rises to meet that standard or not, something essential has already happened. You have aligned your actions with your worth. You are no longer betraying your own needs in order to maintain a connection. You are no longer negotiating your value for the sake of temporary closeness. You have chosen integrity over approval, truth over comfort, and that choice transforms how you experience everything. Because when you operate from self-respect, you are no longer waiting to be chosen. You are choosing. You are deciding what stays in your life and what does not. You are evaluating connections not by how much you feel, but by how well they honor what you feel. This is the quiet authority of self-respect. It doesn't need to convince anyone. It simply acts, and in that action, it reveals everything that words could not. It is easy to feel certain about someone's intentions when you are constantly present, constantly giving, constantly holding the connection together. Your effort can create the illusion of depth. Your consistency can make things feel more stable than they actually are. And your willingness to stay, even in uncertainty, can blur the line between what is real and what is simply being maintained by you. When you are always there, you don't get to see what happens in your absence. You don't get to see whether they reach out on their own. You don't get to see whether they initiate, invest, or show up without being prompted. You don't get to see whether their feelings translate into action when you are no longer the one creating momentum, because your presence is doing too much of the work. Detachment changes that, not as a tactic, not as a way to provoke a reaction, but as a return to balance. It is you stepping back from over-functioning in the connection. It is you allowing space to exist where you once filled every gap. And in that space, something important becomes visible: what the other person does, when the responsibility is no longer being carried for them. This is where true intention reveals itself. Because intention is not defined by what someone says in moments of closeness. It is defined by what they choose to do when there is no pressure, no immediate reward, no guarantee that you are still waiting in the same place. It is revealed in effort that is not prompted, in consistency that is not requested, in care that is not dependent on your constant presence. When you detach, you give them the opportunity to show you that. And what they show you matters. If they step forward, if they begin to match your energy, if they demonstrate through action that they value the connection, then you have something real to work with. Not just words, not just potential, but evidence. You are no longer guessing, you are seeing. But if they remain distant, if they do not initiate, if their behavior stays unchanged even in your absence, then you are also receiving clarity. Clarity that can be uncomfortable, but is deeply necessary. Because it tells you that what you were experiencing may have been sustained more by your effort than by mutual intention. It shows you that the connection did not grow stronger when given space, it simply became quieter. And in that quiet, the truth becomes harder to ignore. Detachment removes the illusion created by overinvestment. It takes away the layers of effort that once masked the imbalance and allows you to see the connection in its natural state. Without your constant input, what remains is what is genuinely being offered from the other side. And that is where your power lies, not in trying to create more, but in observing what already exists. Because when you see clearly, you can choose wisely. You no longer base your decisions on hope alone. You are no longer holding on to potential that is not being realized. You are responding to reality, to behavior, to patterns that reveal themselves when you are no longer overcompensating for them. This is the strength of detachment. It is not emotional withdrawal or indifference. It is awareness without interference. It is you caring but not carrying. It is you allowing someone to meet you where you are, rather than continuously lowering yourself to meet them where they remain. And in that space, truth becomes undeniable. Not because you forced it into the open, but because you gave it room to appear. There is a kind of clarity that only arrives when everything becomes quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty or lonely, but the kind that removes distraction, removes urgency, removes the constant pull to react. It is in that stillness that you begin to hear yourself again, not the anxious voice that fears loss, not the restless voice that wants immediate answers, but the deeper voice that has been waiting patiently beneath all the noise. Silence creates the conditions for that voice to rise, because when you are caught in constant communication, constantly checking, constantly responding, your mind rarely gets the space to process what is actually happening. You are too busy managing the moment to understand the pattern, too focused on the next interaction to reflect on the overall experience. And in that state, confusion thrives. Stillness interrupts that. It slows everything down to a pace where awareness can finally catch up with emotion. It allows you to sit with your feelings without immediately trying to fix them or escape them. And in doing so, something begins to shift, not in the external situation, but in your internal landscape. You start to notice what you've been tolerating. You start to recognize what has been draining you. You start to feel the weight of compromises you once ignored. And while that awareness can be uncomfortable, it is also the beginning of healing, because healing does not start with changing someone else. It starts with understanding yourself, your patterns, your responses, your tendencies to overgive or overstay. Silence gives you the space to explore those things without interference. It gives you the opportunity to ask questions you may have avoided before. Why did I feel the need to hold this together on my own? Why did I ignore what I was feeling? Why did I stay when I sensed something was not right? These are not questions of blame. They are questions of growth. And growth requires honesty. Silence makes honesty possible because it removes the distractions that allow you to bypass it. There is no one else's voice to lean on. No immediate reassurance to soften the truth. Just you, your thoughts, and the reality of your experience. And in that space, you begin to see things more clearly, not just who they were, but who you were in that dynamic. That awareness is where real change begins. Because once you understand your role, you gain the ability to choose differently. You are no longer operating on autopilot, repeating the same patterns out of habit or fear. You are making conscious decisions based on what you now see and feel with clarity. And alongside that clarity comes a sense of realignment. You begin to reconnect with your values, what you truly need, what you truly deserve, what actually brings you peace rather than anxiety. You stop chasing intensity and start seeking stability. You stop confusing attention with care and begin to recognize the difference between the two. This is the quiet work of healing. It doesn't happen in dramatic moments. It happens in reflection, in small realizations, in the gradual strengthening of your relationship with yourself. It happens when you choose not to reach out, not because you don't care, but because you are finally caring for yourself in a deeper way. And in that process, something else unfolds: alignment. Not forced, not rushed, but natural. Because when you are no longer acting from fear or scarcity, you begin to move differently. You attract differently. You respond differently. You become less available to what disrupts your peace and more open to what honors it. Silence is what makes that transformation possible. Not as an absence, but as a space. A space where confusion turns into clarity, where pain turns into understanding, and where you slowly, steadily return to yourself. Thank you for your time and presence. That truly means more than words can express. Wishing you strength, clarity, and peace as you move forward. Goodbye for now.